6 Ka-52 attack helicopters. Fueled. Armed. Sitting on the same apron at the same moment. Ukrainian planners had been waiting weeks for exactly this window. What happened in the next 47 minutes would reshape the entire southern front. I'm your host at UkraineRadar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. And this one changed a great deal. The Ka-52 Alligator is not a simple machine. It is one of the most capable attack helicopters Russia fields. A twin-seat, coaxial rotor gunship built around aggressive forward presence. Combat radius exceeding 250 kilometers. A 30mm autocannon at 800 rounds per minute. Hardpoints carrying up to 12 Vickers anti-tank missiles with a 10-kilometer range. The Ka-52 was designed from the start to dominate low-altitude airspace over armored formations. Russian doctrine put these aircraft at the cutting edge of combined arms operations. The rotary wing punch that follows artillery preparation and precedes infantry advance. Along the Zaporizhzhia axis, that doctrine had been working. Every dawn, the squadron at the captured southern airfield lifted off into gray morning light and went hunting. Ukrainian infantry reported the sound before they ever saw contact. A distinctive beat, low and fast. Then the Vickers missiles. Then burning IFVs on the steppe. Then silence. The losses were not catastrophic in any single engagement. That was the insidious part. The Ka-52 squadron did not arrive with overwhelming force. It struck precisely and withdrew. A Bradley fighting vehicle here, a BMP-2 there, a Leopard 2A6 support vehicle caught in the open. The cumulative arithmetic of that attrition across weeks was strangling Ukrainian armored movement along the axis. Commanders on the ground reported that vehicle commanders had begun refusing to advance after dawn without direct air cover. A significant behavioral shift that shows how deeply the threat had embedded itself into tactical psychology. The helicopters were not just destroying equipment. They were destroying momentum. Ukrainian planners understood this well before they found a solution. The problem was not identifying the threat. The problem was reaching it. The Ka-52 squadron operated from a captured airfield deep enough behind the line of contact that conventional short-range systems could not touch it. Ukrainian air defense crews running French Kisar artillery and American M777 howitzers could punish Russian ground formations, but the airfield sat beyond their reach. And every time a Ukrainian long-range asset tried to suppress the helicopter threat through indirect means, Russian electronic warfare systems around the base created enough interference to complicate targeting. The electromagnetic environment around that airfield was deliberately saturated. The Russians understood what they had. They were protecting it. That made the intelligence problem the first real obstacle. Ukrainian GUR, military intelligence, needed persistent, reliable pattern-of-life data on the squadron's operating cycle. Not a snapshot. A behavioral model complete enough to predict when the maximum number of airframes would be concentrated on the apron simultaneously. That kind of data takes time. It takes patience. It takes assets that can watch without being watched. Which weapon system was ultimately decisive in this operation? Was it A, the long-range strike drones themselves, B, the satellite targeting integration, or C, the GUR intelligence apparatus that identified the window? Comment below with your answer. The breakdown comes at the end. The satellite component involved multi-source collection, commercial imagery, signals intelligence, and data shared through partnership channels Ukrainian intelligence had cultivated across years of the full-scale conflict. At any given moment, multiple orbiting platforms were imaging the airfield at intervals measured in minutes rather than hours. The GUR fusion cell processing this data was not simply stacking images. It was building a behavioral signature. What time did the first maintenance crew arrive at the apron? How long did the ground refueling cycle take for a 6-ship formation? When did the arming sequence for Vickers missiles begin relative to planned sortie time? How long did helicopters typically sit fueled and armed before engines start? Each data point was a piece. The cell was assembling a clock. The picture that emerged over weeks of collection was precise enough to act on. The Ka-52 squadron followed a predictable morning cycle tied to first light sortie windows. Refueling began approximately 90 minutes before planned departure. Arming followed refueling. There was a window, typically 40 to 60 minutes, during which all operational airframes sat on the apron simultaneously. Fueled, armed, engines cold, crews either in pre-flight briefing or walking to the aircraft. During this window, the helicopters were at their most vulnerable. They could not maneuver. They could not respond. In the language of targeting doctrine, fixed targets presenting maximum surface area at a known location during a predictable time. Stay with me, because what the Ukrainian strike cell decided to do with that window and what happened in the 47 minutes after launch is unlike anything we have covered on this channel. The operational planning phase translated intelligence into geometry. The strike cell needed to answer 4 questions before committing assets. Could Ukrainian long-range drones reach the target without being intercepted by Russian air defense covering the airfield? Could the drones arrive within the vulnerability window reliably enough to catch the helicopters on the ground? Could a single strike package generate enough simultaneous effects to prevent Russian ground crews from dragging aircraft to cover before secondary detonations? And what was the acceptable risk to the drone assets given the electronic warfare environment around the base? The answer shaped the strike architecture. On penetration routing, GUR signals collection had identified coverage gaps in Russian air defense around the airfield. The S-300 battery defending the broader area had a known engagement geometry biased against low-slow targets approaching from specific quadrants. Russian radar operators, apparently confident in their fixed-site coverage, had not compensated for terrain masking along an eastern approach corridor. Ukrainian mission planners exploited this. The drones would fly low, terrain-following profiles keeping them below radar coverage, on routes threading through the gaps like a needle through cloth. On timing, the solution was elegant and brutal. Rather than planning a single strike, the cell designed a phased approach. A lead package of 2 drones would arrive first, targeting apron infrastructure, specifically the perimeter to block vehicle movement of the aircraft. A follow-on package of 6 drones would arrive 8 minutes later, targeting the helicopter airframes directly. The 8-minute gap was calculated against the time required for Russian ground crews to respond, assess the damage, and begin any organized extraction of aircraft. 8 minutes was not enough. The follow-on package would arrive into chaos. How many Ka-52 helicopters did the strike ultimately eliminate from operational service? A 2, B4, or C5? Drop your answer in the comments. We reveal the confirmed assessment before the end. The drone assets selected for the operation were Ukrainian-developed long-range strike systems, a category that had matured dramatically across the full-scale conflict into genuinely sophisticated weapons. These were not the improvised first-generation systems from early months of the war. These were purpose-designed strike platforms carrying warheads optimized for hardened military equipment, capable of navigating autonomously for hundreds of kilometers before transitioning to terminal guidance on a pre-programmed target set. Ukrainian engineers and defense industry partners had spent years refining these systems, iterating on guidance packages, improving penetration against electronic warfare environments, and miniaturizing warheads without sacrificing lethality against aircraft on the ground. Each drone carried a shape-charge warhead designed to defeat the Ka-52's composite armor from above, the same attack vector that makes helicopter airframes uniquely vulnerable when they cannot maneuver. There was a complication the strike cell had not fully anticipated, and it nearly unraveled the entire plan. 48 hours before the planned launch window, satellite imagery showed a change at the airfield. A second vehicle compound had appeared on the western edge of the apron, a collection of air defense assets not present during the preceding weeks of pattern-of-life collection. The Russians had moved a short-range Tor-M2 air defense system into position. It was not covering the entire airfield. The coverage geometry from the placement made that clear, but it was covering the eastern approach corridor, the same corridor the Ukrainian strike package was routed through. The GUR fusion cell identified the change within hours. The assessment was urgent and unambiguous. The planned approach route was now compromised. Either Russian intelligence had identified the penetration corridor through signals analysis, or, more concerning, a routine air defense hardening cycle had inadvertently closed the gap Ukrainian planners had spent weeks identifying. It did not matter which. The route was now dangerous. The strike cell had less than 36 hours to redesign the approach. What the Ukrainian planners did next is worth understanding in detail, because it shows something fundamental about how Ukrainian military innovation has evolved across the full-scale phase. Rather than canceling the operation, which was the conservative option, or accepting the increased risk of the compromised route, which was the reckless one, the cell designed a third path, a small electronic warfare package. A standoff jammer operating from Ukrainian-controlled territory would be activated in a sequence timed against the lead drone's approach. The jammer would not attempt to suppress the Tor-M2 entirely. That was beyond its capability at range. Instead, it would create localized interference in the radar frequency bands the Tor-M2 used for target discrimination at the moment the drones were in the most vulnerable portion of their approach. Not a blackout, a distortion. Enough to degrade the system's ability to generate a confident track on low, slow targets threading through terrain for approximately 6 to 8 minutes. 6 to 8 minutes. Enough for the lead package to clear the defended zone. The timing margins were, in the blunt assessment of anyone who has studied this operation, razor thin. The electronic warfare activation had to be sequenced precisely against the drone flight profile. Too early, and the Tor-M2 crew would identify the interference, switch to backup modes, and potentially acquire the incoming drones anyway. Too late, and the lead package would be in the engagement envelope before the jammer was effective. The Ukrainian EW operators knew what was being asked of them. They knew the consequence of a timing error. They executed on schedule. Subscribe to UkraineRadar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what you are about to hear about the final approach and the 47 minutes that followed is unlike anything you have read in a mainstream news report. The strike package launched in darkness, low and slow, terrain following. The lead package of 2 drones followed their programmed routes across hundreds of kilometers of airspace, threading between known radar coverage zones, hugging terrain that masked their signatures, navigating autonomously through a threat environment that would have made a conventional aircraft mission extraordinarily dangerous. Ukrainian drone operators monitored telemetry from a remote location. They could see altitude data, navigation progress, and sensor feeds. What they could not do, by design, to reduce electronic emissions, was issue active guidance commands during the approach. The drones were committed. They would reach the target or they would not. The operators watched telemetry and waited. At approximately 3 in the morning, the GUR fusion cell received confirmation that the strike window was still viable. Pattern of life data from overnight satellite passes showed the Ka-52 squadron status unchanged. Airframes on the apron, maintenance crews at the facility, no indication of elevated alert posture. The window would open in approximately 90 minutes. The lead package was on schedule. At 3:47 in the morning, the Ukrainian EW operators activated the standoff jammer. The timing was calculated to the minute. They held the activation for exactly 7 minutes, long enough for the lead package to clear the Tor M2 coverage zone, short enough to avoid triggering a full Russian sensor response that might generate alerts to the airfield itself. 7 minutes. The operators held the jammer on, watching a clock. The lead package cleared the defended zone. At 4:12 in the morning, the first 2 drones reached the target area. Terminal guidance activated. The drones identified the apron perimeter infrastructure, fuel storage bladders, vehicle lanes between revetments, ground support equipment clustered along the western edge of the parking area. The warheads detonated in a sequence separated by approximately 20 seconds. The first detonation destroyed a fuel bowser parked at the edge of the apron and ignited a secondary fire that immediately created a visual obscurant. Thick black smoke rolling across the western portion of the helicopter parking area. The second detonation struck the maintenance shelter at the northern apron boundary, collapsing the structure and blocking the primary vehicle access lane. The apron was now partially obscured by fire. The vehicle lane was blocked, and Russian ground crews had approximately 8 minutes before the follow-on package arrived. If you believe that tactical preparation defeats improvisation every time, type UkraineRadar in the comments. Because what happened in those 8 minutes is exactly what happens when an army trained on Soviet-era reflexes meets 21 century drone warfare. The Russian response was consistent with what Ukrainian and Western analysts had documented repeatedly across the full-scale phase. Immediate confusion. Radio traffic spiked. Intercepted communications in the minutes following the initial strike showed overlapping voices, contradictory orders, and at least one exchange in which a ground crew commander was asking for authority to start engines and move aircraft before receiving any guidance from the airfield command element. A second exchange showed the airfield command element attempting to reach the regional air defense coordination cell, the same cell that should have been warning them about incoming drones, and receiving no response for over 3 minutes. The Tor M2 crew, their radar still affected by residual interference from the Ukrainian jammer, had not yet generated a confident threat track on the follow-on package. The Russian pilot crews, who had been in pre-flight briefing, ran for their aircraft. Get the helicopters moving. Get them away from the apron. In a different scenario, facing a ground attack, a conventional artillery strike, a single missile, that instinct might have saved some airframes. The Ka-52 can be started quickly, and a moving helicopter is a significantly harder target than a stationary one. The Ka-52 is not a fast-starting machine when the crew is running from a building across an apron through smoke. 4 of the 6 crews reached their aircraft in the 8-minute window. 2 helicopters, according to satellite imagery assessed in the hours after the strike, had their rotors turning by the time the follow-on package arrived. The other 4 were still in various stages of engine start and pre-taxi checks. At 4:20 in the morning, the follow-on package of 6 drones entered the target area. What would NATO targeting doctrine have prescribed for this strike window? Would alliance planners have used a larger package, a different sequencing, or accepted the Tor M2 risk and used the original route? Comment your analysis. This is exactly the kind of doctrinal question that UkraineRadar exists to unpack. The follow-on drones were not targeting the apron perimeter. They were targeting the helicopter airframes directly. Terminal guidance on the Ka-52 is a solved problem for Ukrainian precision systems. The The coaxial rotor configuration, the distinctive tail silhouette, the thermal signature of a warm engine, or recently started power plant all create discriminating signatures that modern targeting algorithms can engage reliably even through partial obscurant. The 6 drones identified their targets autonomously. 3 engaged the 4 stationary airframes. 2 engaged the partially started helicopters whose rotors were beginning to turn. 1 engaged the ground support infrastructure at the eastern revetment line. The detonation sequence took approximately 38 seconds from first impact to last. The detonation of a Ka-52's fuel and ordnance load is not a subtle event. A fully fueled helicopter carrying 12 Vickers missiles and a full ammunition load for a 30mm cannon represents a significant secondary explosion risk. When the first airframe cooked off, the secondary detonation added another layer of fire and fragmentation to an apron that was already burning. When the second airframe went, the blast was visible to Ukrainian observation assets operating at distance. The thermal bloom from the burning helicopters registered on satellite imagery tasked against the target area within minutes of the first strike. The 2 helicopters with rotor systems turning when the follow-on package arrived presented a different problem. 1 lifted. According to intercepted communications and satellite data analyzed afterward, approximately 15 seconds before a drone impacted within 20 meters of it on the apron. The blast and fragmentation damaged the tail rotor assembly and created debris ingestion risk for the turbines. The helicopter did not crash immediately. It climbed, trailing smoke, flying northwest. It landed hard at a secondary location approximately 12 kilometers from the airfield. Post-strike imagery showed it on the ground, rotor blades separated, fuselage damage consistent with a controlled emergency landing. It was not destroyed. It was not flyable. The second helicopter never fully lifted. Rotor systems were spinning when the terminal strike hit the airframe. The detonation was catastrophic. 5 Ka-52 attack helicopters were eliminated from operational service in that 47-minute window. 1 was destroyed on the apron before engine start. 3 were destroyed in the follow-on package strikes while stationary or partially started. 1 was destroyed by secondary detonation from an adjacent airframe. And 1, the helicopter that lifted and flew 12 kilometers, was assessed as non-repairable in the field, removed from the operational order of battle and requiring factory-level maintenance that, given the logistical situation of Russian aviation support, effectively removed it from the Zaporizhzhia axis for the foreseeable future. The 6th airframe, the second helicopter that had been spinning up, survived. Imagery showed it on the apron, damaged but not destroyed. Ground crews moved it to a revetment in the hours after the strike. Ukrainian analysts assessed it as repairable with available assets, likely returned to service within days to weeks, 5 of 6, in 47 minutes. From a squadron that had been stalling an entire southern axis for weeks. The aftermath revealed several layers of Russian failure that go beyond the immediate tactical result. The most damning was the intelligence failure. The Ka-52 squadron had been operating on a predictable pattern for weeks. The Ukrainian GUR cell had mapped that pattern precisely enough to predict a 6-ship concentration window and time a strike to hit it. Russian operations security, varying schedules, concealing patterns, introducing unpredictability into routine operations, had apparently degraded to the point where a senior aviation asset could be surveilled to a targeting quality standard over weeks without triggering any defensive response. There was no indication, in the intercepts available after the strike, that Russian Airfield Command had received any warning about pattern-of-life surveillance. The squadron flew their pattern, established their routine, and the routine became the ambush window. The second failure was air defense placement. The Tor M2 that forced the Ukrainian strike cell to redesign their approach was correctly positioned to threaten the original ingress corridor. But its coverage geometry left an alternative approach available, a more difficult route requiring greater standoff EW support, but viable. Russian air defense planners had closed one gap without surveying the threat geometry comprehensively enough to identify the remaining vulnerability. The Tor M2 was placed based on what Russian planners expected an attacking force to do, not on a comprehensive analysis of all viable attack corridors. Defensive planning against doctrine, rather than against capability. The third failure was response time. 8 minutes between first impact and follow-on package arrival. In those 8 minutes, Russian Airfield Command needed to identify the threat, issue orders to ground crews, start aircraft engines, and begin moving helicopters to alternate positions. They could not. The response was fragmented, communication channels were not functioning effectively, and the crews that reached their aircraft were operating on individual initiative rather than coordinated command guidance. 2 helicopters spinning up rotors in those 8 minutes was the best individual level response available. It was not enough. A faster, more practiced response. Aircraft in hardened revetments rather than on an open apron, engines on standby ready state during vulnerability windows, a practiced quick reaction scramble drill, might have saved more airframes. None of those precautions were in place. The strike cell's use of the initial package to create obscurant and block the vehicle lane was tactically elegant. The fire from the fuel bowser did not directly destroy any helicopter, but it created conditions that complicated Russian response, obscuring visual assessment of the apron, creating psychological urgency that pushed ground crews toward instinct rather than procedure, and forcing any helicopter movement to use a more constricted routing that slowed the process of getting airframes clear. The initial package was not a weapon in the kinetic sense. It was a manipulation of the decision environment. The 6 helicopters it was designed to facilitate striking were always the target. The first 2 drones were delivering conditions, not effects. Ukraine does not just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. And in this operation, the innovation was not the drone itself. It was the sequencing architecture that made 8 drones perform like a system rather than a collection of individual munitions. The satellite intelligence integration that made the operation possible deserves attention as a capability marker rather than simply a supporting detail. The pattern of life collection that identified the vulnerability window required multi-orbit coordination, data fusion across multiple collection sources, and an analytical cell capable of processing high-volume imagery data and extracting behavioral conclusions actionable in a targeting context. This capability did not exist at the beginning of the full-scale phase of the conflict. It was built through partnerships, through training, through the hard experience of running targeting operations under fire for years. The GUAR fusion cell that assembled the Ka-52 behavioral model represents a level of analytical sophistication that would not have been plausible in earlier phases of the conflict. The weapons that flew that morning were the endpoint of a long developmental chain. The intelligence apparatus that aimed them is at least as consequential. The ground effect of the strike on the Zaporizhzhia axis was measurable within days. Ukrainian battalion commanders reported a significant reduction in Ka-52 activity over their sectors in the period following the operation. Sortie rates dropped. The pattern of life that had been producing daily strikes on Ukrainian armor was gone. The surviving squadron assets. A reduced number of airframes, now operating under heightened security protocols and with degraded confidence in their protection, flew with greater caution, higher altitude profiles, and shorter engagement windows. The predatory efficiency that had been stalling Ukrainian armored movement was replaced with something more tentative, more survivable for Ukrainian forces on the ground. The IFVs and armored vehicles that had been refusing to advance after dawn began moving again. That behavioral shift at the battalion level, vehicles moving, commanders committing to maneuver, is difficult to quantify in the clean language of battle damage assessment. It does not appear in the satellite imagery that shows 5 destroyed helicopter airframes on a burning apron, but it is arguably the most significant outcome of the operation. Tactical air threats do not only destroy equipment, they shape decision-making, they create caution, they insert friction. Removing the threat removes the friction. In an offensive operation where momentum is everything, removing that friction is worth more than the destroyed airframes themselves. Real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. What do you think? Was the Ukrainian decision to redesign the approach after discovering the Tor-M2 placement the right call, or should the strike cell have proceeded with the original route and accepted the higher risk? There is an argument on both sides. The original route was more direct and would have required less coordination. The redesigned approach added complexity and timing risk. Comment your tactical assessment. We read every response on this channel. The broader doctrinal implications extend beyond the immediate engagement. For Russian aviation doctrine, the strike demonstrated a targeting vulnerability that had been theoretically understood, but perhaps not operationally prioritized. Fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft sitting on aprons during predictable maintenance and arming cycles are extraordinarily vulnerable to long-range precision strike when the adversary has sufficient intelligence to identify the cycle. Russian aviation operators along the entire southern front would have drawn lessons from what happened at the Berdyansk airfield. The operational security changes, varying refueling cycles, dispersing aircraft to multiple locations, using hardened shelters rather than open aprons, reducing the predictability of scheduling, represent a defensive adaptation forced by one successful strike. Adaptation that degrades Russian aviation effectiveness in its own right, by adding friction and complexity to operations that had been running on smooth, predictable routines. For Ukrainian strike doctrine, the operation reinforced a planning principle that had been emerging across multiple strike campaigns. The most valuable target is not necessarily the most heavily defended one. The Ka-52 squadron was more dangerous as an active operational asset than as a defended target. Its value was in what it was doing, not in what it was worth on a replacement cost basis. Attacking it at its most operationally effective moment, when it was fully fueled and armed, when its absence would be felt immediately and directly by friendly ground forces. Maximize the impact of the strike relative to the cost of the assets expended. 8 drones. 5 destroyed attack helicopters. A southern axis that began moving again. The exchange ratio is not close. The GUR Special Operations community that developed and executed this targeting cycle is not a static organization. It is iterating. Every operation produces data about Russian patterns, about defensive responses, about the effectiveness of different strike sequencing approaches. The organization that planned the Berdyansk airfield strike is more capable today than it was before the operation, because the operation itself generated intelligence about how Russian commanders responded, how quickly their communications degraded under stress, what defensive adaptations they implemented in the aftermath. The hunt for the next vulnerability window is already underway. At first light on the day after the strike, Ukrainian infantry commanders along the Zaporizhzhia axis reported clear skies. No Ka-52 activity. No distinctive rotor beat on the horizon. No Viker missile launches from attack profiles that had become grimly familiar. The steppe was quiet. The IFVs began to move. On the Russian side, satellite imagery from the hours after the strike showed the airfield in partial operation. Ground crews had begun assessing the damage. Recovery vehicles were moving the most heavily damaged airframes. The surviving Ka-52 that had been moved to a revetment was covered with camouflage netting. The airfield was not destroyed. Russia's aviation capacity in the region was not eliminated, but the squadron that had been the predator of the southern axis was gone as an operational entity, at least for the foreseeable future. Will Ukraine use the same targeting architecture again against another high-value Russian aviation asset? That is a question for our next deep dive. Because this operation was not a one-time improvisation. It was a proof of concept. And the Ukrainian planners who built it are already looking at the next target set. Subscribe to UkraineRadar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Now, the quiz answers you came for. Which weapon was decisive? The answer is C, the GUR intelligence apparatus. The drones were the delivery mechanism. The EW support was the enabler. The satellite integration was the sensor. But none of it was possible without the GUR fusion cell that built a behavioral model of the Ka-52 squadron precise enough to identify a 40 to 60 minute vulnerability window and time a strike to exploit it. Weapons without targeting are expensive noise. The intelligence was the operation. How many Ka-52 helicopters were eliminated from operational service? The answer is B. 4 confirmed, destroyed outright, 1 assessed as non-repairable in the field, making 5 total removed from the Zaporizhzhia axis order of battle. The 6th survived with repairable damage, 5 of 6, in 47 minutes. 3 questions for the serious tactical analysts watching this. Was redesigning the approach after identifying the Tor M2 the right call? Or did the added complexity create timing risks that outweighed the threat reduction from avoiding the original corridor? Could Russian Airfield Command have prevented this outcome with standard operational security practices? Varying schedules, dispersing aircraft, reducing the predictability that the GUR cell exploited? And if you were the Ukrainian strike cell commander, would you have launched the follow-on package as planned? Or would the unknown status of the 2 helicopters that had reached engine start have caused you to reconsider the sequencing? Real battles. Real tactics. Real consequences. UkraineRadar. The Berdyansk airfield apron is quiet now. The scorch marks remain where the fuel bows are burned. The debris has been cleared. The revetment that held the damaged 6th airframe is empty. The helicopter moved north, away from a target area that had briefly made Russian aviation vulnerable in a way its commanders did not expect. Modern warfare punishes predictability without mercy. Stay vigilant.